You know that since before the birth of Christ, an empire had been formed in Europe, which was called the Roman Empire. But in the year 285 AD, this empire disintegrated and was divided into two parts, the Eastern and the Western. The eastern part of this empire, which was closer to the civilized East, was in a better situation and continued to exist. But the western part completely disintegrated, with cities fighting each other. That is, none of them accepted each other, and in the year 476 AD, nothing remained of Western Rome. Only groups and groups fought each other. Historians consider this year, 476 AD, to be the year of the beginning of the Dark Ages, a period when darkness and gloom enveloped Western Europe. And this unfortunate period continued until the 11th century AD, meaning that for about 750 years, oppression, betrayal, and crime had enveloped the whole of Europe. In many parts of the world, there were Dark Ages, and years during which humanity and human civilization became worse and worse every day. No one had mercy on anyone, and everyone was concerned about their own survival. If a modern person went to that time in Western Europe, he would think that he had entered a zoo where predatory animals threatened him from all sides. But predatory animals that have tools and kill in the most horrific ways. But the Dark Ages of Europe, which means the terrible and dark period of Europe, is the longest Dark Age and therefore the most famous of them. So get ready. We are going to go to the longest Dark Age recorded in history. Dark Ages. First of all, let's say where the misery started. Since the Roman Empire was unable to completely take over the island of England before it collapsed, that's why when the empire collapsed, it started with the name Britain. When Rome collapsed, the only group that was somewhat cohesive and could have a territory was Britain. But the rest of Europe was killing each other. There was no security throughout Europe, no government. That's why everyone gathered 4 people around them, formed a group, and started torturing and harassing people. The Dark Ages can be translated as everyone is forcing their subordinates, and you can say that this disaster was because no government could gain power. Of course, except for that part of England, which would not have been spared from this disaster if it were not an island. Imagine sitting in your house. Your body is shaking too. At the same time, a few soldiers in iron clothes break down your door and say, "Give us everything you have." And not with sweet words, but by force. If you have a wife and children, they will definitely take them. In this Dark Age, money wasn't common in Europe and everything was barter. That is, someone would give wheat and get rice. Of course, these are the lucky ones who can barter, because usually if you wanted to exchange wheat for something, they would forcefully take the wheat from you and beat you. After a while, finally cities were formed in each part of the country. That is, each city, each settlement had its own king, and some of the people of that city were their soldiers. But still, the people of these cities had no comfort. Either they were attacked from a neighboring city, or their king died and the soldiers started fighting each other, so that whoever defeated them all would become king. And in these fights, this city was destroyed. In this situation, Christianity began to grow throughout Europe from the end of the 6th century. While Christianity was growing in Europe, Islam also began to move from the Arabian desert, and it was during these years that the Sasanian Empire was defeated by the Arab armies after about 21 years in scattered wars, and Islam spread to the entire region. During this time, there was a fierce competition between different religions, so much so that they all burned every book from the past to eliminate each other. And historians say that in this Dark Age, all our savings from the past history were burned to the ground. So let's go back to Europe again. During this Dark Age, there was no food except bread.
Somewhere where there were trees, maybe a fruit would grow, but the main food was bread. If someone in Europe ate meat at that time, it meant that they were either the king of a city or one of the leaders of that city. Otherwise, an ordinary person had nothing but bread. You may not believe that today's civilized Europe didn't even have clean water at that time, and all the water and rivers were polluted. Because in most places, they threw the bodies into the water and wanted to get rid of the bodies in this way, but because of this, they had polluted all the water. That's why no one dared to drink water, and it was during this time that alcoholic beverages became very popular. Because at least they knew that it didn't kill you like water, but it killed you slowly. At this time, Afghanistan and Iran were the centers of science and knowledge, and all the young people came there to learn science. In Europe, all the people were illiterate except for the religious clergy. Many historians have written that in a land where a great empire like the Roman Empire was formed, which opposed the Sasanian Empire, how did it fall into such misery? A land that was entirely under the control of one empire has been divided into hundreds of pieces that are all fighting each other. And their first war is with hunger and thirst. If you went all over Europe, you couldn't find a doctor, and that is, people died with the simplest ailment or disease, even with a small wound. The only way to cure them was to take them to religious priests to pray for them. The ancient Roman era, which was a few hundred years before this, had a lot of medical science developed there, and they diagnosed and treated diseases just like in the East, like Afghanistan or Iran or China and India. But that story of burning books had become such that in all of Europe you couldn't find a literate person, let alone a doctor. But as we said, separate Britain, they were making progress for themselves because the sea was protecting them. This misery continued until some people finally got along with each other. That is, two neighbors united, and gradually it became three neighbors, and it was during this period, around the year 1000 AD, that these small neighborhood alliances laid the foundations of the old cities of Europe. Cities like Paris, like Brussels, which are still just like back then. If you go into their back alleys, it's just like back then. But don't think that these cities have become safe or have an order. A disease is rampant, so that the average life expectancy in Europe was only 31 years. The children who were born and survived at that time were less than 50%, meaning that more than half of the children would have died. Some historians find this change and transformation in Europe very strange. How could a civilized empire at that time suddenly turn into this hell? And not for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, for more than 700 years of living in hell and experiencing it. We can say that the worst time for humans in a corner of the planet was these dark years. Okay, now let's go to the Middle Ages to know a little more about this dark period in Europe. In this era, a child who survived beyond the age of 5 was very lucky, because many children died before they reached the age of 5.
And another important thing is that many mothers also died during childbirth. Women and children died easily for any reason. Men also died from morning to night in conflicts and wars. In the Dark Ages, life expectancy was 25 years. That is, if someone reached the age of 25, it was very strange for others to know how old they had been. But in the Middle Ages, life expectancy was generally 31 years. Don't think that men went to war and were killed. First of all, no man could go out without a sword and armor, meaning if you went out of the house, the chances of you getting involved were very high. Those who had a lot of power would also issue sentences for themselves. Suddenly you see someone being arrested, sentenced to death, and their body hung on the street for everyone to see. Most of those sentenced to death were convicted of witchcraft. If someone said something scientific, they would immediately see that they were speaking against religion and would be sentenced to death, and most of the time they would be burned alive. One of the interesting stories that happened at that time is that in 1600, after 8 years of being imprisoned in terrible black holes, the Italian philosopher Giordano Bruno was burned alive in Rome, just because they said he was against religion. They say that when Bruno was tied to an iron column and firewood was thrown around him to light it, he also calmed down and accepted that he had to burn and die. But suddenly something happened. An old woman came forward with some firewood in her hand, threw her firewood into the firewood and whispered, "God, accept it." Bruno suddenly became agitated, as if this woman's work was burning him to the core. He shouts and tells the woman, "Damn your holy ignorance!" That is what he said in history. Now let's go back to life in the Middle Ages. We said that when you're a farmer, you have a small plot of land and you have to work it with your family. And if you take a day off, it won't work. If you have a son, he has to start working in the field whenever he's 7 years old. A person who became a farmer worked with his family from morning to night. Hard work like plowing, digging, and making, planting, milking cows, and other hard work. But a person who had this job was a lucky member of the Middle Ages because at least he didn't have to go out to fight. The lords also kept their lands mostly safe, but there was no guarantee. One day you saw them come and kill everyone and take them away. In any case, this farmer and his family have to work regularly, and there are no holidays except for a few days a year, which are Christian religious holidays. And Sunday, Friday, and the weekend have no meaning here. As you know, the European continent is green, has a lot of rainfall, and many rivers flow through it. But at that time, the biggest problem for humans was drinking water. The water from none of these rivers was drinkable, not even from any well. That is, anyone who drank it would get sick and die. Usually, most people would get thirsty, or as we said at the beginning of the video, they would drink. But they would all put their dishes in the open air, hoping that it would rain and water would collect in those dishes and they could eat safely. These happinesses that we have told you belong to spring and summer. But when autumn came, everyone's body was worried because they knew that hunger had begun and food was becoming scarce. By the end of winter, people would lose half their weight. You may not believe it, but this is the reality of today's advanced medieval Europe. Farmers who were lucky at that time had an animal. Goats, cows, or sheep. They considered these animals very valuable, and they were more valuable to them than they are today. And they took great care of them so that they wouldn't get sick, because they would give them milk and dairy products as long as they were alive. But when a person dies, you can't replace them with another one. At that time, wherever you passed, you would see many people digging the ground to bury their dead. That is, disease and hunger killed people every day. We said that at that time, if someone reached the age of 30, they would say that they had lived a very long life. If you were a farmer, you had to stay there no matter what, because you couldn't escape. If you left the Lord's border, where there was safety, they would immediately capture you and your family and sell everyone as slaves. If a woman was young, she would be made a sex slave, and a man would be a labor slave. So a farmer had to stay there and not move. Now, let's imagine that a farmer managed to get out of the Lord's estate and reach a city safely. That's when he realizes that he was living in paradise on his farm, because the city is hell. A disease 3 times the size of the entire city is filled with garbage and corpses. Cockroaches and rats become cannibals, meaning corpses and garbage are their food, and because of this disease, it is rampant. Infectious diseases are spreading throughout Europe from all sides, such as plague, smallpox, and dozens of other diseases. You know that in the Middle Ages, one of the most deadly infectious diseases, the Black Death, spread throughout Europe and from Europe to West Asia and North Africa. This disease reduced the world's population by 200 million. If a member of your family fell ill and died, there was no doctor because religion had found the solution. At that time, you had to go to church and ask the church to pray for the sick person. Now, if you didn't die of illness and stayed in the city and survived, sooner or later a very powerful army would arrive to raise the city. If you were a man, they would definitely kill you. They would also take your wife and children to slavery. There is no end to what we can say about the Middle Ages. Let's talk about its Inquisition. Let's talk about the ignorance that reigned supreme. If we were to talk about it, even a 2-hour program wouldn't be enough. The Middle Ages began in the mid-5th century and lasted until the 15th century, a period that was like hell. Although the Middle Ages ended, the rule of the church continued for years until the 17th century and even until the early 18th century, when the church slowly lost its power.
In those days, they didn't shoot for a single non-religious statement, but people were still very afraid. For example, when Charles Darwin said the theory of evolution in 1830, he himself said that by saying this, I was like confessing to murder, and they might kill me. But he was English, and the church didn't have that much power in England, so he was able to survive. What do you think made Europe wake up from its slumber? Leonardo da Vinci. I think we all know him. Most people know him as a painter, an artist. For example, his most famous paintings of the Mona Lisa that the whole world knows him for. But leave aside the painting. Although he was a very good painter, he was also a complete engineer, and some believe that he was a scientist as well. Many scientists believe that Da Vinci should be known as a scientist, neither a painter nor an engineer. So far, 7,000 pages of writings have been discovered that are the work of Leonardo da Vinci, and they're saying that this is a bunch of rubbish. Because at the time when Da Vinci lived, Europe was very religious, and any non-religious writing was burned, destroyed, and even its author was thrown into prison and dungeons. They say that at that time, the international language of Europe was Latin, but Da Vinci did not know Latin, and all of his writings were in Italian.
Because he did not know Latin, he was very unknown while he was alive, and was not as well known as he is today. Leonardo da Vinci was born in Vinci, Italy, in 1452. When da Vinci left school, he had not learned much. He had only learned to read and write Italian. Of course, at that time in Europe, no one was encouraged to pursue science. At that time, they only said to learn to read and write, and nothing more was needed. Leonardo da Vinci was one of the first to say, why shouldn't we learn more? At that time, in other areas, they were hundreds of years ahead of Europe in science and knowledge, and Da Vinci said, why shouldn't we be like them? In the first writings found by Da Vinci, he says that before I write something, I have to experiment, and I don't write until I'm sure it's right. Now, this seems very logical, but at that time, Europe said this blasphemy. That is, he spoke against religion. One of the most interesting experiments that Da Vinci followed and regularly performed was an experiment on birds to see how they fly, and if a creature can fly, why can't we fly? Da Vinci was so persistent that he wrote a book on the subject of flight, which has survived with 35,000 words and 500 drawings for flying. It's interesting to know that these drawings include the design of the parachute that people use to fly from airplanes today. That is, at that time, he said that you can hold yourself with the wind and come down slowly. This design of Da Vinci was a joke for hundreds of years, and everyone made fun of it. But the same design was implemented centuries later, and now the most modern one is being built. At that time, he understood that when a bird is flying, the air pressure under the wing is much higher than on the wing, the same principle that was used hundreds of years later in the construction of airplanes. He even gave designs for sky bridges that were not built with the raw materials of that time. But he designed them, but he did not have the steel and cement to make them practical and durable. Most of Da Vinci's designs were ahead of their time, and no one understood them, or they did not think about them at all, like umbrellas and kites. Or they were designs that were too expensive, and they said they were not worth it. He was so interested in science that he asked the people of his area to give me their dead bodies so I could test them and see why they died, but no one would give them to him. But during his lifetime, he worked on 30 corpses and conducted various experiments on them. He drew all the parts of a human body in his book, which at that time, I had no idea about how the elbow bone was located. In his book, he wrote about how the heart works, which many people made fun of. He had discovered the path of blood by injecting fluid into the hearts of corpses and had written about it in his book. And it was only in the 20th century that I realized that Da Vinci's writings about how the heart works were completely correct. He had realized at that time that some deaths were caused by the heart. He had basically discovered a stroke, which is when a vein is blocked and blood does not reach the heart. Now, you might be wondering how all of Da Vinci's writings have survived, and where were they found? I must say that most of Da Vinci's writings and paintings were found in England and France, like the rest of the world's valuable things that are in museums in France, England, and a few other countries. The best painting by Da Vinci, as you know, is in Paris.
Of course, Da Vinci painted this in Italy.
One interesting thing about Da Vinci is that after he learned to read and write and left school, he had no teachers or professors, and he learned everything himself. He learned to draw, sketch, and design airplanes and other devices from scratch without any teachers. He was truly ahead of his time. In one part of his book, he wrote that music is food for the soul and is an art that can be touched with the flesh. This was a time when there was no proper instrument, and music was not very popular in the world. As you know, Da Vinci was also a sculptor. The largest statue he ever made was a horse that was 6 meters high. He worked on it for 17 years. But when the French occupied Italy in 1499, they smashed and broke the statue, and during Da Vinci's lifetime, this statue was destroyed. If you have seen the video on using the maximum capacity of the brain, Da Vinci is a very interesting example of this. He had developed his brain step by step, and he had become a genius in everything he did, and that was at that time. So if you wanted to, you could. What happened to Europe, trapped in poverty and misery, in disease and darkness, that it suddenly went from one side to the other? The period of this change was so important for Europe that it was called the Renaissance, which, if you translate it into French, means rebirth. Misery in Europe has been deeply rooted since the Roman Empire. This misery and darkness began and continued until the Renaissance. Don't think that the Renaissance happened in a year, 2 years, or 5 years, but this delay continued for hundreds of years. Who knows the Roman Empire? The Western world was completely in the hands of the empire, and this empire disintegrated around the year 400 and was divided into 2 parts: Eastern Rome and Western Rome. This disintegration not only did not advance Rome, but it held it back, and it went backwards so much that a relatively advanced place of that era slowly turned into a truly dark era. The biggest problem of the people of that era in Europe was food and insecurity. At the beginning of the video, we said what a terrible time it was. And whoever had more power would force others, and there were no laws. Since Rome fell apart, laws have slowly been disappearing altogether. They say the Dark Ages started in Florence and spread to all of Europe, and it's interesting that the Renaissance also started in Florence. Florence was the center of European trade in the 15th century, and somehow it was better off than everywhere else. They minted a gold coin and made it popular as money, and called the unit of currency the florin. You might not believe, while we had dozens of types of coins in our region, Europe had no money for hundreds of years, until this florin was created. This money and transactions made Florence the richest place in Europe, and many prominent people of Europe immigrated there. You can see from the paintings of that time that finally, after hundreds of years of misery in Europe, there was some happiness. Because before these paintings were painted, it was all about their sadness and problems, and the paintings were always sad and gloomy. From now on, happier colors are seen, and there is happiness and laughter in the paintings, showing that Europe is changing. The fame of Florence spreads in Europe, and then Florence is the second place that starts to change itself, the Netherlands, because the paintings that are painted in the Netherlands at this time have also changed beautifully and have become happy and content. In the 15th century, one of the most famous people of that time was Leonardo da Vinci. As we said, this gentleman was a very professional engineer, a skilled painter, and most importantly, a scientist. Leonardo's writings, drawings, and paintings helped the Renaissance accelerate. In the same years that Europe tasted the joy of change and its thirst for growth increased, The printing press was invented. If Europe wanted to grow little by little, this invention made the speed of change increase and increase. Because the printing of various books and their distribution throughout Europe made people become more and more enlightened.
In the late 15th century, Europe became a bit more developed and began to go to sea, and various seafarers set out on the seas, the most famous of which was Christopher Columbus, who reached the Bahamas by ship in 1492. Florence continued to prosper until the French invaded Italy in 1499, destroying the largest statue of Da Vinci and taking many of Italy's finest paintings and art to France, which are still in French museums. Now we come to 1599. Europe is progressing well, but the Church is in control. In this same year, Henry VIII becomes King of England. Henry VIII wants to divorce his first wife. He couldn't divorce his wife because he was Catholic, but he wanted to divorce her anyway. So he said that England is no longer Catholic but Protestant. With this religion, he easily divorced his wife. This act of Henry VIII was like a bomb that he dropped on the Catholic religion and shattered its unity. That's why Catholicism became weaker and weaker. After this, Henry VIII lost his new religion in England, and Henry VIII's government considered everything important except religion. They encouraged people to read literature, philosophy, and various sciences, whereas before Henry VIII, Catholicism was the main religion, and most of it was religious education. From now on, England became the pole of European progress, taking this title from Florence. England progressed day by day, and the rest of Europe followed suit. But the issue that greatly accelerated Europe's progress was the French Revolution. Before that, the Church had the main say in France, but after the French Revolution, the government separated from the Church, and this event greatly increased the speed of European progress so that they turned from the peak of misery and misery into advanced countries. This was the summary of the Renaissance, which took hundreds of years to reach the stage. So what do you think now? Thank you for sharing your comments with us, and if you are interested in these types of videos, be sure to subscribe to our channel to watch our next videos. Thank you.